the subject at hand, i.e. Afghanistan after American withdrawal. And then after that I can ask a few questions and then I'll open up the discussion to the floor. So straight away let me go to the far left. Barney, you are the point man, or you have been the point man on Afghanistan under Richard Holbrooks and Khar was his senior advisor during the Obama administration. So tell us very briefly, make an opening statement about A, what went wrong, and B, what are we to look forward to now?
Well, thank you very much. I just wanted to clarify that Richard Holbrooke had about 25 senior advisors. I have no responsibility for what he decided to do. But there are many people who enjoy the bond process, and unfortunately, instead of getting
little louder, please. We can't hear you.
Okay, but unfortunately, they had little alternative but to take up arms after they were being excluded from the system. Now, I hope that the best option will be if we can make this peace process succeed, and there are various signs that we can discuss that it may do so.
Second question, after America leaves Afghanistan, what happens?
Well, as it says in the Holy Quran, there are signs for those who can discern it.
I'm sorry, Manu, you can't be allowed to get away with that. You have to give us an answer.
It worked for him in Khaldun. Finished his muqaddamah with that quote. Look, the American troops, are, one way or another, it is inevitable that the American troops will leave Afghanistan. However, what's perhaps what will determine what happens next will be a product of other factors as well. First of all, will the American and other international financing of the Afghan state continue at an adequate level? Because that will be necessary to implement any peace process or to continue the war, one way, either way. And what happened in 1992 is often misinterpreted. That was not the result of the withdrawal of Soviet troops. Soviet troops left 3 years earlier. The government of Afghanistan and the state collapsed because the Soviet Union dissolved, and therefore the Afghan state lost the financial support that it needed to function. So I would focus more on that question rather than on simply the question of the foreign troops.
Okay, I'll come back to you with some more questions on this, but now to Hina, Rabbani, Khar. Would you like to try and answer the same two questions that I asked Mani, please?
The question was one that,
what went wrong and what do you think?
What went wrong can take 2 days, okay? Because I think, frankly speaking, anything that could have gone wrong did go wrong. But if you were to analyze it and put it down to 3 minutes, I think it would be, first of all, you cannot have success if you do not know what you're in there for. I believe that we were rather murky, or at least the US and allied forces, and Pakistan was also considered to be a partner in that adventure, was rather murky on what the end goal was of that intervention. The intervention was rather large, it was rather big, it was rather costly, $1 trillion plus today. And yet, I think if you were to ask anyone what was the end objective, what was the goal, was it only the annihilation of OBL and AQ, as in Al-Qaeda? Was it state building? Was it nation building? Was it building Alice in Wonderland, a Swiss, type of state in Afghanistan? I think so. The US, what had happened was where President Bush initially announced the intervention, he talked about Al-Qaeda and OBL, primarily OBL. Once they went in, they started doing state building. They realized how miserably they failed in it. Obama came in and said, nation building, state building is no more, we need to annihilate terrorist outfits, and that is our objective, and be out. Unfortunately, 19 years in, we do not seem to have created any circumstances where anyone can argue that peace and stability exists in Afghanistan, or adjoining region, and now it is time that US can say takes it. So I think a major strategic goof up was that there was no clarity on what they went in it for, and therefore they got more and more embroiled. And today, the Afghanistan papers, as the Washington Post is calling them, the reports of Seeger, the Inspector General of Afghanistan Reconstruction, are very telling. Okay, so if you don't want to hear it from me because I'm a Pakistani and I'm biased, but if you hear Ryan Crocker, for instance, in that report talking about, in those papers, talking about what went wrong, it's remarkable, right? And everyone else. What will happen once the US withdraws? It depends on what happens before the US withdraws and in what circumstances the US will withdraw. And if the question comes to what Pakistan's relations are going to likely to be, look, AFPAC or PakAf, whatever you want to call it, is closely correlated to Pak-US and US-Pak. And I genuinely believe that a major reason why Afghanistan and Pakistan were not able to have stable, normal relations was also because Pakistan and US did not have stable, normal relations. And I genuinely believe the reason why Pakistan and US were not able to have normal, stable relations was because the US went in Afghanistan, found that it had gone into a conundrum, could not really explain its failure, and therefore Pakistan became an easy scapegoat. Pakistan did many things which were wrong, but Pakistan got burdened with much more than was its due share of the responsibility for the matter.
Okay. Bani, AFPAC. It never occurred to the American administration that the road to Kabul goes via Islamabad and it should have been PakAf instead of AFPAC.
Well, the purpose of creating a single office for Afghanistan and Pakistan had more to do with the internal operation of the American government than it had to do with the situation on the ground. And this should not surprise anyone who has ever worked in a large organization that most of what they decide has to do with their own internal problems and not with things that come outside. And the problem in the US government was that the embassy in Kabul and the embassy in Islamabad, which were the two major sources of information for the government in Washington about what was going on, had views that were very strongly influenced by their environment. So they would get, to oversimplify, a pro-Afghan position from the embassy in Kabul and a more Pakistani position from the embassy in Islamabad. And that the idea of creating a common Afghanistan-Pakistan office was to force a greater deal of policy coordination within the U.S. government so that Afghanistan and Pakistan policies were consistent with each other. Now, does the road to Kabul go through Afghanistan? Well, as you know, go through Islamabad. As you know, Afghanistan is not a one-way street, it is a roundabout. And so there are many roads to Kabul. And unfortunately, we have to travel all of them at the same time, which is beyond the capacity of our government, generally speaking. But we did certainly think that when I was involved, that Islamabad was very important because this won't be news to anyone, the fact that Pakistan permitted and encouraged the Taliban leadership to operate from its own territory during the entire time was certainly one reason. I won't say it was the reason, I'm not going to say that's the main reason, was a major reason that things deteriorated in Afghanistan. Of course, the Taliban wanted and felt they needed to do that because of the decision made by the United States and some other political actors to exclude them from the bond process in Afghanistan, which maybe, as I mentioned before, was in my view the major error, strategic error, although there are many other perhaps non-strategic errors that took place. So we did try to do that, and during that period, in fact, when my colleague, on my right, was the foreign minister, as you know, we met because I was coming here quite frequently, and I was involved in those discussions. So we worked on that, but the fact that we did not succeed does not mean that we didn't try.
Yeah, you sure did try, and you sure did fail. But the question that I asked was that, when we were waging the jihad against the Soviet Union, the Americans went through Islamabad. And then now once again the Americans are going through Islamabad, because without Islamabad you can't get a settlement. You can't withdraw, you can't get a settlement, you can't talk to the Taliban and so on and so forth. So in between there was something else happening. So that is what I was referring to.
Well, look, in 2001, well, you see, this is what I made, that there's more than one road to a problem. You see, there is the United States, together with Saudi Arabia and China, took the road through Islamabad, or more precisely through Rawalpindi, to Afghanistan in the 1980s.
1980s, he's saying, guys.
In the 1990s, the United States took the road out of Afghanistan. And in 2001, quite literally, the United States took the route from Dushanbe to Kabul. And it was with the help of Iran and Russia and the Central Asian states that the United States launched its offensive against the Taliban. And Pakistan was finally, General Musharraf decided finally that he had to try to join that in order to affect that offensive rather than try to resist it. But Pakistan was on the other side. And at the Bonn talks, where I was on the UN delegation, not the US delegation, but the UN delegation, the United States, Iran, and the United Nations were the three most important actors, and then Russia and Turkey, and Pakistan was quite out of it at the time. So now, I think the United States made a mistake in, let's say, the foreign relations counterpart of the mistake of trying to exclude the Taliban from Afghan politics was in not taking Pakistan's national interests into account sufficiently in trying to stabilize Afghanistan as well, and instead taking the view which unfortunately very powerful countries have a weakness for, which is that they can just force less powerful countries to accede to their wishes through a combination of coercion and bribery, and it usually doesn't work.
Thank you. Hina, if I can turn to you. You said that the Americans weren't clear about their goals, about the end result. Wouldn't you say that much the same sort of problem existed in Pakistan's establishment too? I say that because in conversations with General Kiani, I raised this issue with him many years ago. And at that time our formulation was that what the sort of Afghanistan that we want has to be stable, peaceful and friendly towards Pakistan. And later the word friendly was removed because it created many problems and suspicions in other neighboring countries as though we wanted a satellite there. And then we just remained stable and peaceful. So wouldn't you also say that we were not also clear about our goals?
I think I wouldn't exactly say that for the simple reason that there was a history to Pakistan-Afghanistan relations, right? And I think state to state level we have to accept that they haven't been the best ever. They were one of the countries which did not recognize us and the UN, and that is where the history starts and but the fact is that from the invasion by the Soviet Union and Pakistan's role in it, Pakistan did have, unfortunately, I believe, not for Pakistan's betterment, a central role in the Afghan, situation, right? So when that was to change, as it did with the intervention of the US, now Pakistan could not suddenly wash its hands off everything that had happened over there, in which it had a central role with the blessings of the US and the Arab countries and everyone else. So it was doing what it was doing at the behest of the international community at large, right? And that victory was not only Pakistan's victory, it was everyone's victory. So then to be able to swerve yourself away so quickly may always be difficult. The problem arose, I think, I genuinely believe, that Pakistan seemed to have a better understanding of the ground realities in Afghanistan. When Pakistan shared that better understanding of the ground realities in Afghanistan and said that you cannot exterminate the Taliban and treat them like Al-Qaeda, or that you can't do away with them, Pakistan's intentions were doubted, and Pakistan's, so to speak, role. By the way, I'm not a fan of Pakistan's role in Afghanistan at all. I don't think it has done Pakistan any good. I don't think it has done Afghanistan any good. I don't think Pakistan needs to treat Afghanistan as the fifth province. It's very important that their sovereignty in terms of their choices is respected and appreciated. However, you see what has happened now, as history is going to be written, is that the US has come to pretty much all the positions that Pakistan had been advocating from day one. That you need to reconcile politically, and that is what is going to perhaps bring the type of peace which is an Afghan peace. It's not going to be what we consider to be peace and stability. We have to understand that Afghanistan is not in Europe, neither does it have European conventions or American, I don't know if I can say that, or that it has dynamics, warlordism, etc., which are not going to change by a wand, either used by the Americans or by the Pakistanis. I think Pakistan has a deeper understanding, and when Pakistan was trying to push for peaceful, peace negotiations, it was generally, the US wasn't ready for it. They wanted the kill approach. They were very heavily still invested in the military approach, and that's where it went sour.
Bani, question about what next. You said one of the important factors is going to be how much money the Americans and the international community is ready to put into Afghanistan in terms of trying to protect the current situation there, so that an effective power sharing agreement can be formulated. If there's no money to keep the national army alive and kicking, the Taliban will run riot and seize Kabul. So now, number one question, how much money do you think will the Americans have the ability and the will to put in more money? They've already spent over $1 trillion in Afghanistan, and here we are on the verge of withdrawal without any substantive agreement or any substantive gain. A, will the money be forthcoming? And B, why should the Taliban share power when they know that as soon as the Americans walk out, it's going to be a matter of time before they can seize Kabul?
Well, first, let's not forget a certain very basic reality. And that is that Afghanistan is the poorest country in Asia. It is much poorer than Pakistan. It is poorer than Nepal or Tajikistan. It is poorer than every country in Africa except for just a handful of them. It's only in the past few years that Afghanistan's per capita GDP has reached the level of that of Haiti in the Caribbean. So that is, if you talk about things, Afghanistan not being in Europe, that is a reality of the Afghan economy and resources that cannot be changed just by putting more money into it or order to change. Now, on the other hand, we don't need those $1 trillion and the huge amount. Most of that money never went to Afghanistan and went for U.S. military operations anyway. If there is a peace agreement, it doesn't mean there'll be no more fighting or violence in Afghanistan. There'll still be Daesh and there will be crime and drug trafficking and so on. But if there is a political agreement basically with the Taliban, the level of violence, the level of threat will be reduced. And if that agreement is supported by the neighboring countries, which is something we haven't discussed, but not just Pakistan, but there is much more of a consensus among the neighboring countries than has ever existed before about the future, then the amount of money that will be required will be much more manageable. I would say a couple of $1 billion a year for some time, as long as it is predictable, would be enough. And Afghanistan does not need the type of military that the United States has been trying to build for it in the last several, and it's not capable of managing such a military. So it will have to develop a more indigenous force that can deal with Afghanistan's internal security needs.
So, no, but my question is still up in the air. Why should the Taliban agree to that?
Okay, the Taliban, I think the idea that if the Taliban just wait, then they can take power, and so they don't really have an incentive for a political solution, is mistaken, and it's not what the Taliban themselves think, because winning control of Afghanistan as an international pariah without any assistance is a miserable kind of a victory, which they already experienced and they do not want to repeat it. That is why the Taliban's policy has always focused on trying to legitimate themselves and get themselves recognized. They know if they took power by force as international pariahs, then other Afghans would receive support from other countries in the region and in the world. They would not be able to stabilize the country, and they would be in charge of the poorest country in the world without resources. So that's not the goal that they have set themselves. They prefer to be what I think they will be the most powerful partner in a government that nonetheless will be accepted and supported by the international community, and that means that they cannot behave as they did in the 1990s.
Okay, that's an interesting take. Hina, I would like to continue from where Bani's left off. So on the assumption that the Taliban so this does become an Afghan-led peace process, and at the end of the day, there is some sort of settlement or some sort of power sharing. And the Taliban have become diplomats and have now recognized that they need to get this country, and they can't do it on their own, they need the support of the international community. What sort of power configurations do you see arising in Afghanistan? Where will be Ghani, where will be Abdullah? What will happen to the Taliban? What sort of starting point do you see in terms of the power sharing agreement that might eventually be possible?
Okay, I'm not trying to be diplomatic over here, but it really depends on where the US ends the game, will determine where the game is started from, right? So as we all know, the Taliban are very keen that the first arrangement or the negotiation is going to be between the Taliban and the US on withdrawal. And once the withdrawal arrangement is complete, they're willing to do the Afghan-led, Afghan-owned type of a intra-Afghan dialogue to see what the power brokerage deal is going to be, right? So, once that happens, it depends on if the US, look, I think it's very important to understand that any superpower, real intentions are what? World peace or national interest in terms of having presence in an area where they feel it is important to remain present because they might find danger to be emanating from different parts of the region. So if that remains the US goals, it will be a very different equation that we see in Afghanistan because they would want to continue to have perhaps not so innocent influence in Afghanistan. Right? If they were to cede that entirely, which I doubt the US or any other power which has invested so deeply in a country would do, if they were to cede it, then a real power equation will quickly balance itself as it does anywhere else. You see, the problem is that every time we talk about Afghanistan, you refer to it as a roundabout. And that's like, that's what we love to say, right? That President Karzai, President Ghani, everybody loves to say there's a roundabout, everybody. But the reality is that we all, including Pakistan, the US, the European countries, everybody says Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, Afghans must decide. At the end of the day, it is Afghanistan. If we do not allow the real dynamics in Afghanistan to emerge, to take the decisions, and keep on enforcing what the US thinks is right or what Pakistan thinks is right, Afghanistan is continuing to go through these motions without really going through a sustainable process of evolutionarily, that's not a correct English word, but I'm still using it, through normal evolution reach the power structure, which is, but if, for instance, these people, entities which know they have no ground support, continue to be propped up, then what is going to happen is very similar to what we've experienced in the last 1 decade.
Bani, again, I want to take this point up and come to you. Many, many years ago, you wrote a fantastic book on the fragmentation of the Afghan state. It's a classic, actually. If that is the situation, then where is this evolutionary process? I don't see it anywhere. And there's been so much civil conflict there. And now we're having to now impose another sort of solution, which is dependent on foreign powers, as you say. The next stage, China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, America. So specifically, what role do you see the Russians and the Chinese playing in? I'm going to come to Pakistan later, but Russians and Chinese in Afghanistan.
Let's look at it this way. You mentioned before, Najam, you were talking about the lack of clarity of goals. when I was an American diplomat, and you said not only the U.S. was unclear, but Pakistan was unclear. When I was an American diplomat, I was also, as an academic, organizing track 2 meetings among the regional countries. We would ask the various participants what their intentions were with regard to Afghanistan. And the universal answer that we got from everyone was that until we know what America's intentions are, we cannot determine what ours are. Okay? Because our attitude toward an Afghanistan that is a long-term military base for the United States will be quite different from our attitude toward an Afghanistan that does not have American troops and military bases on its soil. Now, one thing that has changed since the election of Donald Trump is that it is now more believable to the countries of the region that the United States really does intend to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan. And that has become more credible. I tried personally, when I was in the U.S. government, to convince others that President Obama had no intention of leaving the American troops in Afghanistan. But as the representative of Russia said to me in one such meeting, the trouble is, we don't believe you. So now I think they're more inclined to believe it. Therefore, Russia, China, Pakistan, Iran, and others are actually cooperating much more, and also cooperating with the United States. For instance, you know there was there have been a series of meetings of the U.S., Russia, and China, which led to several increasingly specific statements of common purpose on Afghanistan. The last one, Pakistan joined the meeting in Beijing. Iran has still not joined that for other reasons having to do with its relations with the United States, of course. I think that the fact, and at the same time, that has occurred over a period when the economy of China, and to a lesser extent, but also the economy of India, have grown tremendously. Let me just give you a statistic. It's a very approximate statistic, but in 2001, when the United States sent its troops into Afghanistan, excuse me, the economy of the United States was 4 times the size of the combined economies of China, India, Russia, Pakistan, and Iran. Now, the economy of the United States is approximately 20% larger than those other economies. So that means that the relative power of the United States has diminished by something like a factor of 4. So it is now, it is the wrong time historically for the United States to be expanding its military footprint in a region where other countries are becoming more influential. So the key problem then will be to, as part of the overall transition from more of a U.S.-dominated world order to one of multipolarity, of how to negotiate that transition in an area of the world where the United States has not historically been present directly.
Okay, Hina, moving on from that answer. India was expecting to be a player in Afghanistan, has always had interests in Afghanistan. You've had interactions with the Indian establishment as well. India was hoping to open a route to Afghanistan via Iran, which now appears to have been abandoned because of American pressure. Where do you see India going? I mean, is India going to sit back and allow Pakistan and the others to play a major role in Afghanistan? Or do you think the Indians could get up to all sorts of tricks?
A correction, it hasn't been abandoned, and Americans have not made an exception to the sanctions for Chabahar. It's not effective, it's ineffective, but they have not tried to shut that down.
Okay.
Okay, so can I just comment briefly on one thing that you said? Primarily, the question is about troops presence But also the question is, when you withdraw, do you leave a base or not? Do you leave a minimal footprint or not? I think that is central to how this region is going to evolve in the future, because do not forget that I believe China and Russia are very rational players in the Afghanistan game, much more than the US, simply for the reason that they belong to the region, and what happens in Afghanistan has a direct effect on them. So when the US withdraws, whether it withdraws completely or leaves a base, if a military base remains, the dynamics within Afghanistan and outside in the region are going to be very, very different. And I don't think we need to discuss which countries want a military base to remain and which countries don't. But I think Iran's behavior, for instance, will be heavily affected by whether a military base remains or not. Now on India. Look, on India, I think I have a bit of a minority view within Pakistan, simply for the reason that I believe that we should be rational in how we approach this problem, right? Because Afghanistan is a sovereign country which has a right to have any type of relations it wants with any other country as far as they are not hurtful to our national interests and to our peace and to our security. And therefore, for that reason, as Foreign Minister, when the People's Party government was in Pakistan, we actually went in and said it's okay for India to be there at the Heart of Asia conference. Earlier, Pakistan's behavior used to be, if India is going to be there, we are not going to come. I thought it was childish. We thought it was childish, and we went in and were able to do that. However, the difference is, look, if Afghanistan is the center, everyone around the center has a different impact, is impacted by Afghanistan differently and has a different impact on Afghanistan, right? So the immediate neighbors have the primacy in some ways in terms of, I think the national interest, whether it's Iran or Pakistan or any other country, the Central Asian republics, their concerns are more valid and more primary and more important than the ones which are in the broader region. I see Pakistan as one of the primary countries because it's an immediate neighbor, and therefore its concerns must be addressed in a similar way. However, India is an important player within the larger region. So you cannot argue that if China is going to be there and must have a role, India must have no role whatsoever, right? So I think we have to be rational about it. However, this whole thing about India using the town states against Pakistan, all of that, as and when our relations with Afghanistan bilaterally are more, more trustworthy. Right now there's so much, it's almost like we can do them a favor, even that will be misinterpreted. I think that can be addressed. And therefore, for Pakistan itself, we should be less concerned about India's role in Afghanistan and more concerned about how the Afghans view Pakistan, because that is the only way. If we are able to engineer a change in their behavior and their perception of Pakistan, we can engineer a change in Indians' use of Afghan soil against Pakistan.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask two quick questions, two quick answers, and then I want to turn to the floor. Bani, there was some news the other day that an American bombing took out some rebellious Taliban group or some splinter group that was creating difficulties in Afghanistan. Which leads me to ask you this question, two actually, quick ones. A, how united are the Taliban? Are they able to do a deal that they can make stick? Because there are so many factions there, number one. Number two, how serious is the threat of IS and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan to both the Taliban and to the international community?
Well, first, of course, it's difficult to get accurate facts about such incidents, but as I understand it, the group that was attacked, this is in Shindan in western Afghanistan, was the Rasul group, which was a dissident Taliban faction that was secretly being supported by the Afghan National Security Services in order to put pressure on the Pakistan-supported Taliban leadership. So whoever initiated this attack is probably someone who arrived in Afghanistan quite recently and was not very well informed about what was going on the ground. And of course, also many civilians apparently were killed in this attack. So it's a good example of why military approaches are not going to work. As far as the coherence of the Taliban is concerned, I would say the Taliban are as coherent as any other Afghan organization. And they showed in the ceasefire that they observed for several days, a few days ago, that they had a degree of command and control. They're the only organization in Afghanistan where there is a religious obligation to obey the leadership, which is something that doesn't exist in any other political group. So, of course, let me describe it the way a former leader of the Taliban described it to me. He said, of course, there'll be several Taliban commanders in an area. They may have disputes. They may even fight with each other. But he said, this was at a time when Mullah Omar was alive, if Mullah Omar is in order, then they're victim. So they don't control everything that goes on the ground. There's a lot of chaos. But if there's a clear order from the top, that now jihad is over and we're doing something else, then that will be, roughly speaking, obeyed. Now, whether they'll be able to actually implement all the provisions of an agreement is something else. That's much more difficult for them and also for the government.
IS and Al-Qaeda.
Okay. Well, the Islamic State in Afghanistan, this is actually an area, a considerable dispute as to how serious the threat is. Because Russia and Iran, and for different reasons, the Afghan government all depict the threat from the Islamic State in Afghanistan as being quite high. The United States has tended to minimize it to some extent. My own view is that if the conflict between the Taliban on the one hand and the Afghan government and the U.S. on the other hand is resolved to a certain extent so that they are able to make common cause against the Islamic State, then the Islamic State will be much more manageable, even if its ranks are swollen to some extent by members of the Taliban who don't approve of the deal that will come about. And in addition, if this deal is backed by an international consensus that includes the United States, Russia, China, Pakistan, and hopefully Iran, then we may see the emergence of greater coordination against Islamic State. But the Islamic State does not have any clear political constituency in Afghanistan, ethnic, religious, anything like that. So it's hard to see how it could expand much beyond the type of opportunistic troublemaking role it has now.
Okay, Hina, if you were a betting woman, I don't know if you are, there are two narratives here. The first narrative is that the Americans will withdraw in one piece. The Taliban and the Ghani government and Abdullah and all the ethnic groups will sit down across the table under international tutelage and cobble some sort of an arrangement, some sort of a constitution, and things will begin to move forward and the civil war will come to an end. The other narrative is quite the opposite, that the warring factions will remain at war with each other. The Americans will wash their hands of it, the money won't be forthcoming, the Afghan National Army will slowly disintegrate, and the Taliban will eventually, step by step, seize full control. Which would you bet on?
Given the history, if I was a rational bettor, I would bet on the first one. Sorry, the second one. Clearly the second one. No, I...
Rationality seems to be in short supply all over the world, but
No, clearly, you see, because, it's slightly frustrating. I wish, I hope you can, I'm sure it's even more frustrating for you, because as someone who sat out of government for 7 years now, when I look at the narrative shaping and the challenges that people talk about, and also the solutions and what they're willing to do and what they are doing, it's almost like you didn't leave at all. Things haven't moved, right? And the same problems keep on reappearing in different forms and shape. So yeah, a rational thinker, I would say. But clearly, I think also, now there is perhaps a deeper understanding because of a lack of interest, more than anything else, and public pressure which is emanating from countries, especially the US, of the public to withdraw. So,
thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we started 15 to 20 minutes late, so I'm going to take 15 and 20 minutes more out of my time. And the next guys can do the same to the next guys who follow them. So I'm turning it over to the audience. Let's have some hands. And, well, of course, the first speaker will be Mark, of course.
Thank you, Najam. Mark Diagram. When I was High Commissioner in Pakistan, I always felt that part of the misunderstanding and misinterpretation of Pakistan's actions on Afghanistan by the United States, my own government and Europe was down to the fact that the Pakistan military, I never felt, had an Afghanistan strategy. They had an India strategy, and Afghanistan was a subset of that India strategy. And because the United States military in particular was split, so that CENTCOM dealt with Afghanistan and Pakistan, but not India, because that was dealt with by the Pacific Command, they found it very difficult to understand the dynamic of why the Pakistan army acted as it did in Afghanistan. So my question really is to Hina, Rubin and Khar, and she says very farsightedly the view that Pakistan probably has to accept that India is going to have a role in the future of Afghanistan once the Americans have left, and it probably does generate into this sort of lawless situation that Afghanistan has been in for hundreds of years. Do you think the Pakistan army will accept that same view as you do, that actually it's legitimate for India to have its interests in Afghanistan?
All yours.
Okay, so Mark, unfortunately things have really changed from when I was talking about, because we were talking about a country where Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister. Now we're talking about a country where, so theoretically speaking, the Pakistan military and Pakistan, I think we were quite on the same page when it came to the view that we must understand that India will have not a central role, but a role which is viable given its geographical location, right? However, given India's recent actions and almost splintering into a rogue state, I think it's very difficult even for a person like me to not be doubtful of what India is up to using Afghan territory. But as I said, I think the rational thinking over here again is that in order to influence the Afghans, we have to normalize with the Afghans to be able to control any bad or unhealthy activity that India may want to do from Afghanistan, rather than trying to control it at the international level. I don't think it's possible. And I think the Pakistan military, like the Pakistani state, hopefully is going to be very rational about this. But current circumstances expect no one to understand India not having very, very, hostile intentions for Pakistan, be it from Afghanistan and even it's actually though he's actually said it in his statements, he said it in his policy. So unfortunately we have very little room to not doubt India's intentions.
Can I just add, China believes that India has an important role to play in the future of Afghanistan. So, and they've made that clear. They will take Pakistan's interests into account, but they don't believe in the work of trying to exclude India from Afghanistan.
So, Hina, sorry, just to clarify the question that Mark raised. Subset. Afghanistan is a subset of Pakistan's India policy. Is that going to change? Because if it's not going to change, then things will be very different.
To be fair, I absolutely believe that in the last 10 years, Mark, that has absolutely changed just by way of the importance of Afghanistan being in center stage and the western border becoming more active than the eastern border. I'm talking, pre-Modi situation, right? So I think events and how we act and react to each other have a huge impact. So 7 years back, I was saying that the Pakistan military together with it was a view that we had in the Foreign Office, and it was a view that we were able to convince the Pakistan military, and they came around to it. And frankly speaking, on that Heart of Asia conference, by the way, General Bayani and the ISI chief at that time were also there, as were other intelligence chiefs. So this was a view which was taken. But given the current circumstances, of course, it's difficult to.
Yes, you could do that, but please ask a question, no speeches.
I never ever gave you a speech in the past. In my opinion, the US...
Question, please, because we need other people to ask questions. Please.
It is very brief.
I
It's
will
very
interrupt
brief.
you if you would give speeches.
There's no speech here.
Can you just ask a question, please?
Okay, it's a question.
Yes, question.
The question is, I'm putting my question to both of you. Do you think that the US is serious having any meaningful dialogue with the Taliban? Do you really think that USA has it in mind that when those Taliban's representatives come forward for negotiation, USA has in its mind that they should be identified and they should be killed. Don't you think that is the only objective USA has in its mind, instead of having any meaningful dialogue with the Taliban?
Thank you. That was very good. All yours, Barney.
Oh, the United States has had an extremely meaningful, not just dialogue, but intense negotiation with the Taliban for a year and a half now, and we haven't killed them. So, I don't know what more evidence we could want.
I've been given the mic, so may I ask
Yeah,
my
the lady
question?
there has the mic,
Yes,
so.
Elaine Alam. My question is on the Afghan refugees living in Pakistan. We're still hosting 2 million Afghan refugees. I ask this because I want to know whether this is a Pak-Afghan topic at all. In my experience, from what I've experienced, the military establishment does not want a solution to it, does not want to do anything about it.
Question, please.
Yes, so my question is this a Pak-Afghan topic, and what future do you see with the Afghan refugees living in Pakistan?
Thank you. Thank you.
I would like to thank you for that question, because I think this is a very important question and it's at the heart of many problems that we have. So when we say that Afghanistan must be respected as a sovereign country, that means that Afghanistan must also take on its sovereign responsibilities, right? Pakistan, I think, was rather large-hearted in inviting these refugees to come and live without any barbed wires that you see going up in Europe, in Austria, and in the way the United States is treating, some of the Mexicans. So it's exceptionally important. I think that's where Pakistan was on the right. So when Pakistan is on the right, we need to celebrate that, right? However, the Afghan refugees do need to be taken in by their own nation as their responsibility, because if Pakistan was a fantastically prosperous nation which was able to meet all the responsibilities of its own nationals, we would happily take 2 million, 3 million more, right? But when we are unable to feed, educate and provide health provisions to our own, I think we're not in a position to offer, so I think this is a two-way street. Afghanistan must be respected as a sovereign nation, all their decisions must be respected, but also their responsibilities must be taken by them and not
But does
enforced by
Afghanistan
them.
want to do that this last year? Does Afghanistan want to do that at all? Do they want to take
I think on this we have to be very clear, whether they want to do it or not, like the fencing question. If it is in your national interest, you must do it. When you become this loose, you are actually not securing your national interest.
Right. Okay, the gentleman over there.
My question is, in view of the changing regional scenario, with the emergence of Daesh and the Indian aggression on Kashmir, in view of the changing regional scenario, with the emergence of Daesh, Indian aggression on Kashmir, and the ongoing parallel between Afghan Taliban and the Americans, do you see any possibility of reconciliation or approachment between the TTP, the terrorist element, and the state of Pakistan? Because we have deployed more than 300,000 regular and paramilitary forces along the western border, and strategically it is not possible to fight the two fronts, one with India and another with Western. We have to go for one option.
Yeah, I don't think it's a clear and present danger today. I don't think, 10 years from today this might have been a legitimate or I don't think there is any equalization of the two. And TTP is no more an entity which has space in Pakistan to operate at its whim. We lost a lot of soldiers, we lost a lot of civilians in trying to be able to clear this land, and I think we must recognize
Yes, I rather suspected that my dear friend Musaddaq Malik Sahab was dying to ask a question. And I was trying to urge him to raise his hand, and which he's finally done. So the mic should go to him now.
They don't divide any longer. Historically speaking, I think in strategy you don't fight the burden of geography or history. Generally you don't do that. And historically, if you look at Afghanistan, you see a hub and spoke system. Afghanistan is Kabul, the government, and then it has a client-patron relationship with all of these tribal areas. So in the new stable structure, whatever stable structure comes forth, who do you see at the hub? And do you still see this hub and spoke client-patron relationship where all the tribes appeased by, and who will fund it? How will it get funded, this new stable structure, if it's going to be the old one? Bani, that's for you.
Well, that reminds me of a story when Khrushchev came to the United States in the 1950s, and he asked to meet with people who really run the United States, and so they brought him some business executives, including the president of NBC, Robert Sadlov. And Sadlov asked him some question about the situation in the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev looked at him and said, "Things have changed in Minsk since you were a boy." So things have changed in Afghanistan since those times, and not only in Afghanistan, but around Afghanistan. As I mentioned, with the rise of China, India, and so on. So, plus there has been a very serious generational change in Afghanistan with the increase in the spread of education and travel and so on, and even just being refugees, you know, more Afghans have traveled abroad than Americans. They're not in the same conditions, but nonetheless, travel does dwell in the mind, even if it's as a refugee. So it's not going to go back to some previous situation. The potential for positive change lies in the economic development of the region and the possibility of linking Afghanistan, you know, the word being connectivity. And in the context of a political settlement, which includes settlement between Afghanistan and Pakistan, then the Chinese, Indian, Iranian, and so on efforts of connectivity could support the development of an Afghan state eventually, which will be still not a hugely powerful one. The structure you mentioned, of course, who controls territory in Afghanistan still is very important. And those that are able to mobilize people to control roads and areas will still be the most influential people. But we can also see, you know, for instance, the Taliban is a phenomenon that never existed before in Afghan history because there was no way that a group of religious clergy could exercise political power. Only people who controlled land and animals and tribes could exercise political and military power. But now a religious group can do it because they can tax the drug trade and the smuggling which is coming in through Dubai and so on. So, you know, I think we can expect to see new and different phenomena, and you know, there's no reason to expect that there will not be a lot of political change and even instability, but hopefully there will be enough international consensus and incentive that it will not rise to the level of being the type of threat that it has posed to the people of Afghanistan and to the others in the world in the last couple of decades.
Thank you. I'm having to wrap this up on that uncertain note. Thank you very much, everyone. Please, a good applause for how long you did this.